Back in 1971, an extraordinary court case took place, in which the main crime was conspiring to contravene the Wireless Telegraphy Act. It involved a series of individuals, many of whom are no longer with us, and a company that formed the foundation of a remarkable career of an intelligence-gathering, case-solving private investigator who is still with us. The story I'm about to tell you has been all but lost to time, but using reports and information from the time, I've managed to piece all of it together. There's no speculation, conjecture or embellishment, just the facts, exactly as they were reported between 1968 and 1971. Let's start with a firm called Robertson Co. They started to emerge in the mid to late 1960s. The director of the firm was Ian Withers and his father, and Ian, along with his brother Stuart Withers, set up what was termed a private inquiry company. Writer Douglas Howell said in 1968 that for money they'd do anything to invade and destroy the privacy of an individual, and made themselves available at short notice, 24/7, to bug and tap anything they technically could. They were also available for hire by companies to either guard or steal business secrets, according to Howell's report. They advertised via a minute ad that appeared mainly in the Marylebone Mercury and Kensington Post back in the mid to late 1960s. Before then, they were a rather more obscure company, only appearing in confidential documents, supplied only to established inquiry agencies, legal offices and authorised businesses. For 5 guineas they could find a person's bank balance. Details of the credits and debits in the account would also be revealed, but the charge for this service was by quotation. An ex-directory phone number was traceable for £3 3s, and a forwarding address from the post office cost 4 guineas. They'd provide a person's criminal record for only 3 guineas. The brothers behind the firm were in their 20s in the mid-1960s. They first had an office in Wallington. They had small Japanese TV cameras that could pick up details in a room 100 yards away, pretty impressive for the 1960s. The picture could be shown on a monitor screen or recorded, and you could hire this for £70 a day. In the office was a store for the transmitters, recorders and other electronic gear used for investigations. One radio bug that used a transmitter to send the microphone's captured audio and would fit into a cigarette packet cost £12 12s. For those with a bit more money, a better model, British made as opposed to the other one, could be purchased for £35 15s. It had a range over 150 yards and a battery life of 200 hours. Robertson Co warned that these units contravened GPO regulations and that they'd take no responsibility for them, words that would soon come back to bite them. Charges for investigations cost between £200 and £1,500, and they'd refund the client 80% of the hiring charge if the equipment was recovered after the operation. The firm said it could also gain entry to people's homes by posing as meter readers and the likes, and it justified its actions by saying they didn't think it was wrong to spy on employees of a firm if they're selling your secrets to rivals. In many divorce actions, the only way they could gain evidence was by bugging a bedroom and getting in at the right moment to take a statement. Withers never revealed how they got information about bank statements, ex-directory phone numbers or a person's criminal record, but he wasn't bluffing and managed to obtain reporter Douglas Howell's phone number within minutes in 1968. They employed 8 full-time agents in the late 1960s and had extensive contacts with European private eyes and branches of nationalised boards. There was also a store detective section run by Phyllis Clark aimed at capturing shoplifters. During 1966, Robertson Co were based out of Strathmore House in Beecher's Avenue in Carshalton, which I suspect may have since been demolished. By 1968 they were based out of this premises, Nelson House in West Street, Carshalton, where Ian Withers lived in the adjoining flat. The company was the subject of a World in Action programme on September 19, 1968, but as far as I know, this doesn't exist publicly. Today, Ian Withers is 84 and enjoying retirement after a lengthy career as a private eye, and Stuart Withers is around 79. Ian was a police officer when he set up Robertson Co. Incidentally, he wrote 2 books, and while he's not affiliated with me or this video in any way, I'm halfway through one of them, and it's a fantastic read. Christopher Robertson Co first ran into legal troubles back in 1969. The firm of private eye operators worked in a way repugnant to all decent Britishers, a divorce court judge said as he reported them to the Director of Public Prosecutions. A man called William Edward Williams went to them in an attempt to obtain evidence for a divorce on his wife Nancy Williams after he suspected her of having an affair with William Ernest Arnell. An agent from Christopher Robertson Co. allegedly gained entry to her house under the guise of somebody conducting research in the area and planted a bug in the main bedroom. On the night of February 22, 1969, William Edward Williams and the inquiry agents listened to a transistor radio in a van some distance from the house. At around 10 to 10:15 p.m, they heard what they thought was 2 people snoring, but it wasn't. Mr. Arnell and Nancy Williams were in fact watching television. Then, just after midnight, were alleged to have brushed Nancy's son out of the way when he answered and barged their way into the house. They went upstairs and 3 of the men told the judge that they found Arnell and Nancy Williams in the bedroom that had been bugged. Nancy Williams recognised 2 of the men as visitors to her home in the previous week. She alleged that one of them, John Franks, said he was from the Borough Surveyor's office. While taking the measurements he said he needed, Franks planted bugging equipment next to the fireplace in the bedroom. He was supposed to go back to the van and listen to the bug on the radio, but there was an issue with the batteries and it didn't work. Gabriel Mannion called a few minutes later, saying he was conducting a survey, and kept Williams at the door while Franks went upstairs and adjusted the bug so it worked. The Withers brothers were also accused of tapping telephone calls to Williams's home. Judge Baker heard evidence from Christopher Robertson Co agents John Franks, Gabriel Mannion, a then 17-year-old trainee, and Stuart Withers, Ian's brother. He described it as a case of an honest man falling into the hands of unscrupulous young men working for the firm of Christopher Robertson Company. Ian Withers said after, "I don't think there was anything unethical or illegal about what we did when we used the bug, but in view of the judge's comments, we're unlikely to use it again. I couldn't find any information on the outcome of this case, and I'm assuming it was dropped or not taken any further." The next element of this story is Edward Babbs, who in 1971 was 43 years old. Babbs was a one-time Liberal councillor and social worker who later bought the Loch Marie, a 15-bedroom private and residential hotel specialising in long-term guests. Loch Marie Hotel, which was at 58 Westmoreland Road, Bromley in Kent, doesn't exist today, but stood where this apartment building is today. Edward Babbs was subject to a complex and frightening series of events that took place over 3 years in the late 1960s into the early 1970s, which I'm going to try and put together for you. The telephone calls came first, at all hours of the day and night. He was kept awake at night by the mysterious calls that contained heavy breathing on the other end. At the time, Babbs was going through divorce proceedings, and a divorce was granted in 1970. He thought the calls were connected with the divorce proceedings, but the GPO later established they weren't. Everywhere he went, he was followed by a woman in a car. When he approached the woman and asked her what she was doing, she would become abusive or duck down in her car and pretend she wasn't there. Babbs went to the police, but they said there was nothing they could do about the woman trailing him in the car. He was even sent a wreath with a message accusing him of having an improper relationship with a member of his staff. As far as he was concerned, it was a clear case of torture by telephone, a calculated campaign of hate against an innocent man. The situation nearly made him crack. It was hell, and the whole thing seemed endless according to him. The next element to this story is Margaret Coulson, a then 54-year-old matron of a nursing home near the Loch Marie Hotel that Edward Babbs owned. Edward said he first met Margaret Coulson when they worked together as social workers. They became friendly but only as business and political colleagues, and their association went no further than the exchange of Christmas cards. Coulson was behind the phone calls and was responsible for following Edward Babbs as he went about his business. For reasons that have never been made clear, Coulson hired detectives at Christopher Robertson Co. to find out if Edward Babbs was committing adultery with hotel receptionist Marianne Carter. Edward knew nothing about Margaret Coulson's plot to out him as an adulterer until the next element of this remarkable story came into play. William Borland had been a radio amateur for 20 years when these events came to a head in 1971. His call sign is G3EFS, and he was around in 2023 at least, but my attempts to contact him have been unsuccessful, and he'd be in his late 90s if he's still alive today. He was out for a walk and had his transistor radio with him. He heard something peculiar on the radio set and knew straight away it wasn't coming from a BBC play. He went to his home in Broadoaks Way in Bromley, switched his main radio on, and heard a male voice say, "I think I'll get up now, Bess, and go and have a bath." The voice appeared to be coming from someone's bedroom. Listening further, William could hear the tinkering of cups, and then the man told Bess to get off the bed, which was followed by a bark. Borland continued to monitor the frequency for around 2 weeks before he decided to trace the signal to the Lochmarie Hotel, just over 0.3 of a mile away from his home. Speaking with Edward Babbs, it soon became clear that he had a Dalmatian named Bess. Convinced that there was some sort of clandestine bug within the confines of the hotel, Borland broke the news to Edward that he suspected someone was bugging the hotel and that somewhere not far away a room was being monitored. A search revealed a radio transmitter taped to a skirting board behind a chest of drawers near Edward's bed. He immediately called the police, and they promptly arrived and began scouring the area. With nothing appearing out of the ordinary, the police sat in wait, and eventually picked up John Franks, one of the detective agency's part-time assistants, as he smuggled himself into Edward Babbs's room to change the battery on the bugging device. Franks led them to a vehicle belonging to the agency, which contained a radio receiver and tapes for recording conversations picked up from the bedroom. Very quickly they found a radio receiver tuned to the frequency of the transmitter in the hotel bedroom. Ian Withers told police that the radio transmitter belonged to his company, Christopher Robertson Co. He explained that they'd been hired by a nursing home matron, Margaret Coulson, to find out, for no apparent reason, whether the hotel proprietor was having an affair with his receptionist. But why bug Babbs? He was living apart from his wife. Well, for some reason, Coulson was anxious to obtain evidence that Babbs was committing adultery with the receptionist. She was clearly besotted with him and didn't want him involved with anyone else. It was alleged that a woman from Christopher Robertson Co. booked into the hotel but couldn't find any evidence of adultery on Babbs's part, but she kept a key which someone else used to install the bugging device. The trial took place in June 1971 at the Old Bailey. Ian and Stuart Withers, along with John Franks, Gabriel Mannion and James Swan, were charged with conspiring to contravene the Wireless Telegraphy Act by installing unlicensed apparatus and conspiring to commit trespass. Ian was 30 by this time and living in Ashburnham Road in Richmond, Surrey. Stuart was 25 and living in Amberley Close in Horsham, Sussex. They were sentenced to 9 months in jail, suspended for 3 years, and fined £300 each. They were also ordered to pay £250 each towards prosecution costs of about £3,000. You can be sure that in those days, with the way that other wireless telegraphy incidents were dealt with, the emphasis in this case was very much on the radio side of things, rather than the accusation of conspiracy to trespass. The law has always dealt extremely heavy-handedly with those who breach the regulations of the Wireless Telegraphy Act. John Franks was 35 at the time and lived in Falbrough Crescent in Hadley, Essex. He was fined £100 and ordered to pay £50 towards prosecution costs. He'd be 89 if he's still around today. The then 20-year-old Gabriel Mannion of Gull Close in Wallington, Surrey, was bound over or made to promise to behave for 3 years after he admitted conspiring to trespass. Mannion was also ordered to pay £23 towards his own defence and £25 towards prosecution costs. He'd be 74 today. Pleas of not guilty to conspiring to use unlicensed radio equipment and conspiring to trespass were accepted from James Swan, who was 28 of Hatton Road West in Croydon, Surrey. It was also revealed during the trial that Christopher Robertson Co. were called in to bug an office in London so that telephone conversations could be taped. Mr. Justice Roskill told how the company had trespassed across the line between what is legal and illegal in a way which can only leave a sense of outrage. A plea of not guilty was accepted from Margaret Coulson, who was charged with conspiring to trespass. She was 54 at the time and lived in Durham Avenue in Bromley. She'd be 108 now and obviously not around anymore. A woman at the nursing home she worked at said Mrs. Coulson doesn't want to comment or make any statement about the case. Edward Babbs revealed he was convinced that he knew who was behind it all along. He said the campaign was a war of nerves, nothing more or less, and an attempt to find proof that something improper was going on. Now I just want to be left alone to get on with my business. I've suffered enough. Marianne Carter, the hotel receptionist, said, "I'm sorry, but I don't want to talk about it. The allegations, which are completely unfounded, have caused me enough damage as it is." Edward Babbs would be 97 if he was still around today. I never managed to find out what became of him. Back in the first case, where Christopher Robertson Co were accused of bugging and trespass at Nancy Williams' home, the judge said there is an association of British detectives, but none of these people belong to that association. Ian Withers said that it was because the association charged a fee they were not prepared to pay. The judge said, "I have not the slightest hesitation in saying that he does not belong because the association requires standards of honesty and decent behaviour from members." The Withers brothers were indeed later affiliated with the recognised organisations within the field and went on to found successful private investigation companies themselves. Ian is retired today after 60 years as an international investigator and intelligence provider who's dealt with some extremely high-profile and sensitive cases and whose books I can highly recommend.